He looked at my snow boots dripping on my mother's hardwood floor and smiled like I was exactly what he expected. Nothing. I'd driven 6 hours from Ottawa to get there. 6 hours through a January whiteout on the 401, the kind of drive where you grip the wheel with both hands and pray the transport trucks slow down. I hadn't eaten since a coffee and a gas station granola bar outside Kingston. My back hurt. My eyes were dry, and the first thing I saw when I walked through my mother's front door wasn't my mother. It was sitting in my late father's armchair, watching the hockey game with the volume up too loud, a bottle of Molson's on the side table that hadn't been put on a coaster. My mother came out of the kitchen wiping her hands on a dish towel. She looked smaller than I remembered, thinner around the shoulders. She hugged me and I could feel her ribs through her sweater, and I thought, that's new. Sweetheart, you remember Gareth? She said. Gareth didn't stand up. He glanced over from the TV, looked me up and down and said, long drive, you look rough. That was how it started. I'd heard about Gareth for about 8 months. My mother had mentioned him first as a friend from the curling club, then as someone I've been spending time with, then finally, last Thanksgiving when I couldn't make it home, as my partner. He was 61, retired. He'd spent 22 years as a senior superintendent with the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And he wanted you to know that about him within the first 5 minutes of any conversation. It was the first thing he told people. It was probably the first thing he told my mother. I set my bag down by the stairs and said nothing. I was 31 years old. I had learned a long time ago that silence is not the same as weakness. Sometimes silence is the smartest thing in the room. My mother made tea, and the three of us sat at the kitchen table. She'd made a roast. The same Sunday roast she'd made my whole life, the one with the Yorkshire pudding and the thick gravy that my father used to say was the only reason he'd survived Canadian winters. It smelled like home. It smelled like everything that used to be right. Gareth sat at the head of the table, my father's chair. I noticed that immediately. I didn't say anything. My mother passed the potatoes and asked about my drive, and I told her about the snow, and she made a face the way she always did. Worried, always worried. And then Gareth said, without looking up from his plate, she's fine. Women always dramatize road conditions. My mother laughed, a small, careful laugh. I looked at her. She didn't look back. I stayed that night in my old bedroom. The walls still had the marks from where I'd taken down my posters before I left for university. The bed had a new quilt on it, something floral and pastel that my mother must have bought recently. I lay there listening to the furnace kick on and the wind rattle the storm windows, and I told myself, you're here for 4 days. Just 4 days. Be patient. Watch. The next morning I came downstairs early. I wanted coffee and maybe a few quiet minutes before anyone else was up. Instead, Gareth was already at the kitchen table with a newspaper and what was clearly his third cup. The kitchen smelled like cigarette smoke, faint but there underneath the coffee, and I looked around and saw a small ceramic dish on the windowsill above the sink that hadn't been there before. An ashtray. My mother didn't smoke. My father hadn't smoked. Nobody in our family smoked. I poured myself a coffee and sat down across from him. Your mother says you work for the federal government, he said, not looking up from the paper. Something like that, I said. He turned a page. What department? It's complicated to explain, I said. He looked up then. He had pale blue eyes and the kind of face that had probably been handsome once, and now just looked certain of itself. I spent over 2 decades in federal law enforcement, he said. I think I can follow along. I'm sure you can, I said. I just don't usually discuss it. He held my gaze for a second, longer than was comfortable, then went back to his paper. Security clearance types, he said with a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Always so mysterious. I drank my coffee. My mother came down 20 minutes later in her housecoat and watching her move around the kitchen, refilling his cup without being asked, moving quietly, not taking up much space. Something settled in my chest like a stone. I recognized the movement, the smallness of it. I had spent my career learning how to read people, and I could read this. That afternoon, my mother and I went to the grocery store. Just the two of us. Gareth had some calls to make, he said, and waved us off. The moment we got into the car and the doors closed, my mother exhaled like she'd been holding her breath all morning. He's a lot, I said carefully. She started the car. He just has strong opinions. Mum, he's been very good to me, Jess. She used my nickname, the one nobody else used. The house needed so much after your dad. The furnace, the back step. He handled all of it. You have money for that. Dad's pension, the RSP. We've made some adjustments, she said quickly. Too quickly. She pulled out of the driveway without checking her mirror properly, which she never did when she was anxious. It made sense to consolidate some things. Gareth has a financial advisor he trusts. Eyes. Out the passenger window at the January street. The snowbanks were grey with road salt. A Canada Post truck was idling at the corner. What does consolidate mean? I asked. She didn't answer right away. Then it means things are fine. Don't make it a thing. But I was already making it a thing, quietly, privately. The way I did everything. That evening, Gareth opened a bottle of red wine. And within 20 minutes, he was telling us stories I suspected he'd told many times about a high-profile organized crime investigation he'd led in British Columbia in 2003. My mother listened with her chin in her hand. She laughed at the right moments. She refilled his glass. When he finished, he looked at me. You probably deal with nothing that interesting, he said. Government desk work. Some days are more interesting than others, I said. In the RCMP, we had a saying about civilian government types. He smiled. All clearance, no action. I smiled back. Funny, I said. After dinner, he said he needed a smoke and went out to the back deck. He smokes in the house sometimes, she said, almost to herself, not quite to me. I've asked him not to. He's trying to cut back. There was a butane lighter on the kitchen windowsill, next to the ashtray. How long has he been staying here? I asked. He moved some things in October. She didn't turn around from the sink. Mum, does he contribute to the mortgage? The bills? Jessica. The full name, now. I am not discussing my finances with you. You're discussing them with a man you've known for less than a year. She turned then. Her eyes were wet, which I hadn't expected. I have been alone in this house for 2 years, she said. 2 years. Do you know what that's like? Do you have any idea? I thought of my own apartment in Ottawa. The quiet of it at 7 a.m., the specific aloneness of a Sunday. I'm sorry, I said, and I meant it. She turned back to the dishes. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in my old bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about what she'd said. Consolidated finances. A trusted financial advisor. An RRSP that my father had spent 30 years building. I thought about Gareth in my father's armchair. In my father's chair at the dinner table. Behind my father's back deck, railing in the dark, with his cigarette. I got up at 2 a.m. and sat at my old desk with my laptop. I'm not going to say exactly what I looked for or how, because that's not the point of this story. But I looked, and what I found made me very, very still. The next 2 days I was careful. I helped my mother with things around the house. I watched. I was polite to Gareth in the way that you are polite to someone when you are deciding something about them. He noticed the politeness and seemed to interpret it as submission, which meant he relaxed and got louder. That's usually how it goes. On the third day, Thursday, it snowed again. A heavy, wet Ontario snow that turned the backyard into a white silence. We had lunch and then my mother went to lie down. She got headaches in winter, always had, and Gareth and I were alone in the kitchen. He was on his second Molson. He'd been on his phone a lot, stepping into the hallway when calls came in, speaking low. You ask a lot of questions, he said without preamble. I was washing my coffee cup. Do I? Said you've been asking about the finances. He set the bottle down. That's not really your business. I turned off the tap. Dried my hands on the kitchen towel. Turned around. She's my mother, I said. And she's a grown woman, he said. 63 years old. She doesn't need her daughter managing her decisions. I'm not managing her decisions, I said. I'm paying attention. Something shifted in his face. I was superintendent of a federal policing district, he said. I interviewed career criminals for a living. I know when someone is insinuating something. Then you're very experienced, I said. He stood up. He was tall, I'll give him that. He had the kind of size that he knew how to use, the kind that fills a room. He walked toward me and stopped about 4 feet away and pointed. Not at me, toward me, the way some men do, not quite touching, so they can say they never touched you. I don't know what you think you know, he said, but I will tell you right now, in this house I am the senior person. I have rank, I have authority, and I do not answer to you. There it was. I had been waiting for that sentence or something like it since Sunday evening. I had felt it coming the way you feel weather coming. A pressure change, a particular quality to the air. I didn't raise my voice. I want to be clear about that because it matters. Everything that happened next happened very quietly. I went to my bag, which was sitting on the chair at the end of the kitchen table. I unzipped the inner pocket. I took out my credential wallet, the one I carry every working day of my life, the one that has been through security briefings and parliamentary committee rooms and 3 different department heads' offices, and I put it on the kitchen table. Let me clarify something, I said. He looked at the wallet. He looked at my face. He looked at the wallet. Again. Federal credentials. My photograph. My name. My title. Senior Intelligence Analyst, Canadian Security Intelligence Service. And below that, a line he would understand immediately, because he had spent 22 years in federal law enforcement and he knew exactly what certain designations meant and who held them and what their operational reach looked like. His finger came down. He stood there for a moment reading the card, reading it again. The color in his face went somewhere else. Cesses, he said. Just the word. Like he was testing it. I don't typically introduce myself that way, I said. But since we're talking about rank and authority, I thought it was relevant. The back door opened. My mother came into the kitchen in her housecoat and slippers, rubbing her eyes. Is someone making tea? She said. I smelled coffee and thought. She stopped. Looked Gareth's face. Looked at mine. What happened? We were just talking, I said. Gareth sat back down very carefully, like his knees had gone uncertain. My mother looked at the table, at the credential wallet still open on the kitchen table. She was quiet for a long moment. Jess, she said slowly, how long have you? Since I was 24, I said. I didn't tell you the specifics because I'm not supposed to. You knew I worked for the federal government. She sat down across from Gareth. She pressed her lips together. Then she looked at him. Really looked at him. Maybe for the first time in months. And I watched something move across her face. A recognition. The particular look of a woman who has started, for the first time, to do the math. You told me she was a bureaucrat, she said to him. He didn't answer. You made a joke about it, she said. At Christmas dinner. You made a joke. Silence. I sat down at the table. The 3 of us sat there in the winter kitchen with the snow coming down outside, and I said as gently as I knew how, Mum, I need to talk to you about some things I found. About the financial advisor. About what's been moved and where. You don't have to talk about it right now, and you don't have to do anything today. But I need you to hear it. She reached across the table and took my hand. Not his. Mine. Okay, she said. Gareth left the next morning. He didn't make a scene about it, which surprised me, and then didn't once I thought about it. Men like Gareth. Men who have spent decades performing authority, who have built their entire self-image on rank and title and the deference of others, don't tend to make scenes when the scene has turned against them. They reassemble. They regroup. They find someone else. I watched him load 2 bags into his truck. My mother stood in the front hallway and didn't go to the door. After he was gone, she made us scrambled eggs. We sat at the kitchen table, 2 women in a quiet house in January, and she asked me questions and I answered them as honestly as I could, within the limits of what I'm allowed to say. We talked for 3 hours. She cried once briefly and then stopped and got angry, which was the right response, the healthy one. I found her a referral to a financial lawyer in her city. Someone who could help her look at what had happened with the accounts, what could be recovered, what she was actually entitled to from my father's estate that may have been redirected without her fully understanding what she was signing. I stayed an extra day. We watched 2 movies and ordered Thai food from the place near her house that she loves, and she told me that the headaches had been worse since September, and I made a note to check in about that. When I left on Saturday morning, she stood on the front step in her boots and her old green parka and waved until I turned the corner. I drove the first hour in silence, not the bad kind, the kind that means something has settled back into its right place. I have spent my entire career being invisible on purpose, sitting across the table from people who underestimate me, letting them talk, letting them position themselves, waiting until the moment when the thing I actually am is more useful than anything I could have said at the start. My mother called me 3 weeks later. The financial lawyer had found 2 documents she didn't remember signing, both related to the RRSP, both recent. There are processes for that. There are people who handle exactly that kind of thing. She's fine now, better than fine, actually. She joined a hiking group in February, something she'd wanted to do for years, and somehow never had the time or the confidence. She sends me photos sometimes. Frozen lake trails, frost on pine branches, 4 women her age in bright parkas laughing at something off camera. She looks like herself again. That's the whole point. That was always the whole point.